Welcome to Season 4 of the Comfortably Hungry podcast, where yesterday's dinner is tomorrow's history. If you're a peckish person who is curious about the history of food and drink, then you're in the right place. I'm Sam Bilton, an author of some rather niche books who adores her history and food. And by the end of this podcast, I hope you'll be a fan of food history too. You can see what historical delicacies I'm cooking at the moment on Instagram, Threads or Blue Sky at Mrs. Bilton, that's with 2 S's. In Season 4, we're going to be immersing ourselves in the fascinating world of fresh water, which as we all know is vital to life. We'll be journeying through the centuries to learn more about the food, drink and medicines water provides, its spiritual significance, discovering how water has been used to prepare and preserve our victuals, and how water has been utilised as a source of power and transportation for the food sector. Some of the topics will be obvious, but as ever, I hope that one or two will be pleasantly surprising. As with earlier seasons of the Comfortably Hungry podcast, the guests will be invited to bring a dish to the season's virtual potluck supper. And we've had some delicious contributions, I can tell you. The paid subscribers to the Comfortably Hungry Substack will also get access to recipes inspired by the topics covered in this season. There's nothing quite like the atmosphere of a proper produce market. I suspect a fair few of you like to immerse yourselves in the hustle and bustle of a market, marvelling at the array of colourful vegetables, sparklingly fresh fish, pungent cheeses and toothsome breads. And I'm with you, but sometimes I think it's easy to forget the hard graft that's behind getting this produce to the consumer. The toil of the growers and the long hours of the sellers is, I think, largely overlooked, and probably always has been, obviously aside from the men and women directly involved in this trade. As International Women's Day approaches this Sunday, I wanted to explore the history of a truly remarkable woman who conquered the world of market trading in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
She began in the precarious world that Mayhew described, which was this world of shivering children and halfpenny bundles, but she refused to remain there and she transformed a marginal street trade into a commercial empire.
So I think we're seeing from, quite early on that she's a woman of steel. She's going to, provide for her children and make her own way.
She must have been sort of one of a kind, really. For everyone to sort of romance over, her work and her achievements. Yeah, she's revered. She's a bit of a legend. Not talked about enough, probably.
I first encountered the subject of today's episode a few years back when I was doing some research for a BBC documentary on the history of Covent Garden in London. I have to confess that I'd never heard of this lady, but after hours of trawling records in the London archives and scouring newspaper and census reports from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, I began to piece together her life. And it's a real rags to riches story, I can tell you. This lady rose from poverty on the streets of Birmingham to become one of the most successful and wealthiest market traders at Covent Garden, all from selling bunches of watercress. So renowned was this woman that on her death in 1927, she was mourned as the Watercress Queen. I'm taking a slightly different approach to this episode as I'll be speaking to a few different experts to build a more complete picture of her working environment and the challenges she faced throughout her life. Welcome to the world of Eliza James. Born in Birmingham in 1855, Eliza was the second youngest of tailor Thomas Currell's 6 children. The occupation of tailor suggests a skilled worker, perhaps making smart suits for the city's gentlemen. But as Henry Mayhew noted, the tailoring trade is divided by the workman into honourable and dishonourable, with the dishonourable giving the work out to sweaters, to be done at less than the standard price. It's unclear from the census records of 1861 whether Eliza's father was responsible for doling out poorly paid work or whether he was one of the sweaters himself. Given that Eliza claimed that she began selling watercress on the streets of Birmingham for 17 or 18 hours a day from the age of 5, it seems likely that he was a poorly paid worker in the garment industry. Census records can be incredibly useful when tracing family history, but as they are only conducted every 10 years, they merely provide a snapshot of a person's life. And a decade is a veritable lifetime in a child's history. Eliza's childhood, if we can even begin to call it that, was a hard one. Between 1861 and 1871, we know that Eliza lost her father, who committed suicide by taking an overdose of laudanum. We also lose track of her mother around this time. It's possible that she adopted the name of a new partner without actually remarrying, as there are no matching marriage, death or census records for a Lucy Currell after Thomas's death in 1866. By the age of 15, Eliza is residing in the Warwickshire Reformatory School for Girls in Coventry. These reformatory schools were designed to provide convicted juvenile offenders with the skills to equip them for entering domestic service, but only after they had served up to 2 weeks in prison. Sadly, there are no longer any records available for the Warwickshire Reformatory School that Eliza attended, so we don't know exactly what she did to wind up there. Parents of inmates were required to contribute to the cost of this education by a payment of up to 5 shillings per week, so someone in Eliza's family, possibly one of her older siblings, was intent on getting her back on the right track. So what was life like for watercress girls like Eliza? I spoke to food historian and one of my partners in crime on the A is for Apple podcast, Dr Alessandra Pino, to find out. Ali, you live in London and you're currently undertaking a Gothic journey down the Thames and writing a book with Dr Dan O'Brien about consumption, memory and death, based on the research that you both did for our recent Serve It Forth Food History Festival. But today we're going to talk about another dark aspect of London's history, the plight of the watercress girls. So we know from various accounts of the watercress sellers written by people such as writers and philanthropists like Henry Mayhew and John Groome, that many of the watercress sellers were young girls like Eliza James or old women. So why did they have to resort to this sort of work?
Well, late Victorian London was a city of extremes, I think. On one hand, you've got imperial wealth, railway expansion and luxury food imports, and you've got fashionable promenades through Covent Garden. But on the other, you have entrenched urban poverty, and families lived in overcrowded courts and rookeries. Casual labour was unreliable, and illness, injury, or the death of a wage-earning father could plunge an entire household into crisis almost overnight. And you mentioned my work on the docks, and that's just something that I'm discovering at the moment, how precarious the work of the dock people was. They'd have to crowd every morning and see whether they would get chosen for that particular job, that they were waiting for. Otherwise, they'd have to sleep there in that same area and wait for the next day. So it was all very kind of precarious. For girls in particular, obviously the options were limited. So domestic service required references and often a respectable background. And factory work was regulated, but it was still very harsh. And street trading, by contrast, required almost no capital. And as John Groome observed, you could begin with just a few pence. And that tiny outlay made watercress selling accessible to children, to widows, to the elderly and the disabled. And the alternative was often the workhouse. And the workhouse carried enormous stigma, though, and it meant separation from family, it meant institutional discipline and the erasure of independence. So even the most precarious street trade allowed a degree of autonomy. And as Groome put it, many sellers were dying inch by want and starvation, yet they preferred that struggle to entering the workhouse, and selling watercress, however meagre the return, allowed them to say, "I earn my bread." And Mayhew's interviews actually are particularly haunting because he describes an 8-year-old girl who had already lost all childish ways, and her face was thin and prematurely lined by hunger, and she spoke like an adult because necessity had sort of forced her to grow up.
It's very harrowing, actually, reading some of his accounts for costermongers in general, but particularly the Watercress girls. She says she can't read or write, doesn't she? But she knows exactly how to count money and how much things are worth.
Yes.
So can you describe what their working day was like?
It probably, almost certainly began before dawn, and most watercress sellers arrived at market between 4 or 5 in the morning at places like Covent Garden Market or Farringdon, and they would inspect the hampers by candlelight. The cress arrived from the countryside, often from Hampshire's chalk streams. They were damp and cool and intensely green, and the girls would haggle for the best price that they could manage. And they bought by the hand, so one hand produced several small bundles, and they were typically sold at a halfpenny each. And in the warmer months, cress was actually more plentiful and cheaper, but in the winter, it was scarcer and harder to sell. Once purchased, they tied the bunches neatly and then they set off on foot, and they walked at roughly 2 miles an hour, calling out their wares in the early morning streets, and their customers were largely working class labourers like bricklayers or carpenters, porters, heading home from night shifts or out to work. But, earnings were very fragile, and a very poor seller might only make 3 or 4 pence a day, and some days maybe just a shilling. And out of that came the cost of the stock, obviously, so profit margins were very thin. So half or 2/3 might be profit, but only if everything was sold. And if it didn't, obviously the cress wilted and that day's investment was lost. And also most of these street sellers were children, so they would sell until everything was gone. Often they skipped their breakfast meals, were maybe just bread or tea and perhaps a little bit of butter, but meat was very rare. And one girl that Mayhew interviewed saved her pennies for clothes. So it's striking to me that watercress was sold as a symbol of freshness and health, sweetening the blood in the spring, yet those who sold it were often malnourished themselves. In Naples, we always say, the son of the shoemaker has broken shoes. It's just a way of saying that when you have a trade, il figlio dello scarparo ha sempre le scarpe rotte. The son of the shoemaker always has shoes with holes in them.
Yeah.
Because, you're selling this symbol of health and freshness, but you yourself are malnourished and struggling to live.
So what did people like John Groom do to help these girls and perhaps raise awareness of their plight?
So John Groom founded the Watercress and Flower Girls Mission in the 1860s near Covent Garden, and his intervention recognised that these sellers formed what he called a poor and neglected class. The mission provided practical relief because there was morning cocoa and hot dinners for a halfpenny, facilities for washing, mending clothes, and even a clothing club and a penny bank. And so there were sewing classes, so girls could also learn a different skill, so they didn't have to get stuck in that trade. And a loan fund helped them survive the winter months when trade was thin. Importantly, Groom also created a sort of moral and social infrastructure, because there would be a Sunday school and Bible readings and a basket stall and barrow club, so sellers could gradually acquire better equipment instead of just carrying these makeshift bundles as they would. I mean, whether we view this as benevolent paternalism or essential support, it did actually offer some material help within that community. I'm going to ask you a question. Have you ever heard of William Savage? He was an English composer.
No, I haven't heard of William Savage.
He operated in the 18th century, and he was an English composer and singer and organist. And he became known as a performer at St Paul's Cathedral. I've been very much into his work because he composed a range of vocal pieces based on the street criers and all the wares that they used to sell. And one of these is "Come Buy My Watercresses," and it's preserved in the British Library. The song belongs to the tradition of London cries. So William Savage basically adapted the calls of street vendors into these stylized art songs for polite performance. I've actually recorded it on the piano myself.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's brilliant.
It's quite sad. And it
is.
says, "Come buy my watercresses, my nice young watercresses." But that's the tune.
Now that is a haunting tune, and I think it strikingly reflects the plight of the Watercress girls, described by Groom and Mayhew. But what does life have in store next for Eliza? In 1877, Eliza married a mariner, William Griffiths, in Liverpool. William soon gave up his seagoing life to become interchangeably over the years either a fruit or watercress salesman, and by 1891, the couple had 6 children and lived in Sheffield. Despite having 6 children to look after, her youngest Edwin was still a babe in arms in 1891, Eliza appears to have been thoroughly involved in the family business, which, given the events to come, was a jolly good thing too. William was a short man, with, it seems, an equally short temper. He was also a heavy drinker. During their marriage, he frequently assaulted her, often in front of witnesses, and stabbed her on at least 2 separate occasions. On the 3rd of March 1897, William was convicted of a breach of the peace and sentenced to 6 months at HMP Wakefield, his 3rd prison sentence. Eliza filed for divorce the very next day on the grounds of William's adultery with 2 women, coupled with his cruelty towards her. In her petition, she stressed that from the outset of her marriage, she had maintained herself and her children out of her own resources. Now, you may be wondering why Eliza put up with William's abusive behaviour for so long. Although the Matrimonial Causes Act had come into effect in 1857, the sole reason for divorce remained adultery. Prior to this act, divorce on the grounds of adultery was only granted by Parliament and was incredibly costly to obtain. So Eliza had to wait until she had proof of William's infidelity before she could escape to London. Before I continue with Eliza's story, I want to get a better understanding about market life during this period, to get a feel for how Eliza honed her expertise in the watercress business. I spoke to Cheryl Cohen, former director of London Farmers Markets, who shares her passion for markets, sustainable food and food stories on her Queen of Markets Substack. Hello, Cheryl. I know you've worked very closely with markets and farmers markets in particular. So what is it about markets that fascinates you, and what indeed makes a good market?
Great question, Sam. So it's the feeling that I found the heart and soul of a town or city, the place where local people shop. And that's really important. I'm not interested in markets that focus on tourist trade or are predominantly hot food stores selling high-priced food made from low-quality ingredients. A good market will feel as if you're completing a jigsaw when you walk in. You're part of what makes a good market tick. I want to see a good range and balance of stalls, hopefully with prices visible, helpful stall holders, really tempting displays, and ideally it will be accessible and not overly crowded. Although having said that, I've been to so many markets where the crowds have been part of the charm. Oh, and cafes and loos nearby are always a bonus.
Aren't they just? Eliza, who we're talking about in this episode today, was operating in a wholesale market. So how would these differ, say, from a street market?
So wholesale markets in central London were almost all covered markets, and they specialised just as they do today, although given their long histories, they didn't always do so. So Smithfield, meat and poultry, Billingsgate, fish, but Spitalfields and Covent Garden, flowers, fruit and vegetables. They weren't always as ordered as they are now. So Covent Garden, until about 1830, was and everything was everywhere. And then order was introduced with vegetables to the south, vegetables to the northwest, and fruit to the north. Street markets mostly specialised, although there were some which sold various miscellaneous goods. So Charles Booth in Life and Labour of the People of London notes that Petticoat Lane specialised in household goods. Brick Lane, you could find live birds and animals for pets. Leather Lane, well, yeah, obviously sold tools and appliances. You could get fruit and vegetables in Goot Street, Leadenhall, general country products. There was also markets such as Rag Fair, used by second-hand clothes dealers near Tower Hill, and they sold to retail and wholesale purposes. And the other difference is many retail food markets stayed open until midnight. So with Saturday evenings being the busiest time after people had received their weekly wages.
Yeah, because that actually would make sense when you think about it. Nowadays, obviously, we're used to going to the markets, and we think actually about going to produce markets, I think, of going early in the day. But,
yes,
people used to work really rubbish hours, didn't they, in sort of the Victorian era?
Yes. We think about night markets as being something exotic and something we go to in Thailand, perhaps. But the fact that they existed here for many, many years.
So which market in London was the most renowned for watercress?
Farringdon, it had, I think, something like, it handled up to 20 tonnes of watercress weekly during the season.
Wow.
I think the annual metropolitan wholesale estimates something like 13 million bunches.
Crikey.
Yes.
So we know women worked in produce retailing, but how unusual was it for a woman to own a fruit and vegetable produce business during this period?
So it wasn't unusual for women to set up on their own and sell at both wholesale and street markets, but often they were small scale. So Henry Mayhew mentions flower girls, apple women, and upwards of 3,000 women, as he says, with shallow and head baskets, or their faces red with the weight of a loaded head basket. The majority of street sellers, oranges and hazelnuts, for example, were women and children. Close to 30% of businesses in Victorian Britain were owned by women, and many grocer stalls were owned and run by married couples. What was against the female entrepreneur at the time? Lack of capital. So unless you inherited money, it could be very difficult to start a business. Social stigma, whether you had skills and trainings, the law. But for example, lots of women ran coffee stalls, but it cost £5 to buy the stall and the stock, and they had to have someone to keep it. So only someone who had the money would be able to do this. I think that's why you've got so many women and girls on the streets, because it didn't cost much to sell up and buy, sell watercress or oranges or whatever the product might have been.
Was Eliza quite unusual to get to the level?
So I think we're seeing from, quite early on that she's a woman of steel. She's going to, provide for her children and make her own way. It was cheap and hard work to sell watercress on the streets, and many stayed there. But Eliza didn't just sell watercress at markets and on streets. She went directly to restaurants. She went to stores. She went to hotels. She built up a solid trade, which no one else was doing. She comes across to me as a tough businesswoman, someone who faced early challenges, and, she didn't give up.
What was a market trader's day like? Because Eliza talks about being at the market from 3 a.m. to 10 a.m. and that's literally just the start of a day. She obviously carried on working after 10 a.m. She wasn't going back home to bed at 10 a.m. I mean, is that typical, or was that typical of the time? And has it changed much in this day and age?
It was absolutely typical, and no, it hasn't changed at all.
Wow.
If you go to New Covent Garden now, you'll find very similar hours. The fruit and veg stalls will open at 10 p.m. and business closes at 6 a.m. Little later for flowers, they will open at 4 a.m. until 10 a.m. And most business is done in the early hours of the morning so that, greengrocers can get in there and, like Eliza, buy what they need and then start their business. So Mayhew says, the Farringdon Cress Market begins long before daylight. On your way to the city to see this strange sight, the streets are deserted. In the squares, the blinds are drawn down before the windows, the shutters closed. So the very houses seem asleep. All is so silent you can hear the rattle of the milkmaids' cans in the neighbouring streets. So he interviewed a few people. One said the usual time to go to the market is between 5 and 6 in the morning, and from that to 7. And myself, I'm generally down in the market by 5. I was there this morning at 5, and bitter cold it was, I give you my word. But the general market opened at 4 a.m. with Watercress retailers granted special permission to enter 1 hour early at 3 a.m., drawing hundreds of vendors and buyers into the quadrangle before dawn.
Goodness. Well, I'm glad I'm not in the market industry myself.
No, absolutely.
You'll be relieved to hear that Eliza's fortunes begin to change at the beginning of the 19th century. Despite William countersuing Eliza for divorce on the grounds of her adultery with a Mr. James Fleet, who we will hear more of shortly, she did eventually get her divorce, leaving her free to start anew both personally and professionally in London. James Fleet was a butcher from Blackburn. We don't know how or when they met, but given their trades, a market seems a probable setting for their first acquaintance at some point during the 1890s. They married in 1902 and set up home in Lambeth, London, with Eliza's 2 youngest children. By 1911, Eliza was a self-employed salad saleswoman, although in a 1915 business directory, she is listed as one of 4 Watercress salesmen, already demonstrating that she could hold her own in the management of a successful market business. Now, you may have noticed that her second husband's name was Fleet. But we have been talking about Eliza James, which is how she appears in business directories from the early 20th century. Why did she choose not to adopt her husband's surname for her professional persona? I like to think it was her way of asserting her independence as someone who worked on her own account. There seems little doubt that she and James Fleet had a happy marriage. But after the tribulations of her first marriage, you can't blame Eliza for wanting to make the point that she, and she alone, was responsible for her success. And Eliza was tremendously successful at selling watercress. In 1912, she was interviewed by the Daily Mirror, which claimed somewhat contentiously that she had amassed a fortune of £20,000 3 or 4 times over in her life, which would be the equivalent of several millions today, all from selling watercress. It was, they said, one of the most wonderful romances of business London has ever seen. Eliza attributed her success to hard work in all weathers. Study your customers, she said, and never disappoint them. Give them the best and you must get on. Eliza was a self-professed workaholic with an aversion to taking holidays. She was at the market from 3 a.m. until 10 a.m. every morning, after which time she had to check the deliveries of fresh watercress coming into the city from the countryside. Her only hobby appears to have been keeping chickens. At the time of the interview, she was reputed to have a virtual monopoly on supplying London's hotels and restaurants with watercress. Her success had also enabled her to buy a country house, a motorised riverboat, and a watercress farm in Hampshire, a county which has a long historical association with watercress. Which is where we are heading now to find out more about watercress cultivation and why watercress is so special, with Tom Amery, Managing Director of the Watercress Company, which grows watercress in Dorset, Hampshire and Spain. Welcome to the podcast, Tom. So the Watercress Company was founded over 30 years ago. So why watercress? What's so special about it?
Well, thank you very much for having me, first of all. Watercress has got a lot of things special about it, really. There's 2 ways of looking at it. It's a plant, it's part of our culture, but it's also part of our diet. So I would say that there's 2 areas that you need to be focusing on. Diet can be obviously focusing on, taste and flavor and all of those aspects, which watercress has got bags of it. If anything, it's like a kind of Marmite. Some people love it and some people hate it.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So it's that pepperiness. Some people see that as bitterness. And therefore our flavor kind of profile, and that's part of our own DNA, how we perceive bitterness. And some people take it as pepperiness and other people don't. That's part of our DNA, and I don't think we can change that. But then culturally, it's got kind of these life-giving properties. For a long time, it's been sort of part of our annual diet, you could say. So we're going back thousands of years. And food is medicine, as we all know. And watercress is often regarded as a medicine, not really as kind of a fix, a disaster type medicine, but more of a food stuff that is great to consume throughout the year or certain times of the year. It does have its unique properties, which when our modern science has sort of found some reasons for the benefits. It's long been known that it's a cleanser of the blood and it has these great properties. So yeah, I would say culturally and in terms of food and taste, it's been important.
Does it have a season then?
Yeah, it does. And we're growing it generally. The main sales of watercress in the UK now are kind of out of season. So the natural season for watercress is to do with its flowering cycle. So whenever you go back to a plant, always just think about when is it supposed to flower, when is it supposed to seed, and obviously replant itself, replenish. Watercress does grow from a vegetative format, so you can take a cutting. So if in the wild a piece snapped off and it floated down a stream, if it found somewhere suitable to lodge itself, it will regrow. So it's got this amazing kind of opportunity to replenish itself in vegetative formats. But when it does that, that's like kind of it's carrying its DNA that it's got currently with it. But then in order to reproduce itself, it obviously self-pollinates with other plants in the area, produces a seed, and that seed's normally dropped in around about sort of May or June time, maybe a little bit later, depending on how summery it is. That seed will then go through a process to germinate again during that summer period. And then start to grow again, ready for the following year. So it's often seen as a biannual, but it can obviously set seed and reproduce in the same year to make it an annual. But if you just let watercress grow and it doesn't get dislodged and it continues to produce seed, it could go on for many, many years. So a plant could literally just keep on growing, and it eventually in the wild, it will get to sort of like a celery stalk and thickness.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and then eventually it'll get so heavy and sort of weighty that I think the water would then start breaking it up and pieces snap off. But it's extremely easy to propagate. It's just really hard to cultivate, which is very different.
Which brings me on to my next question. What are the key criteria to be able to grow watercress successfully?
Growing watercress isn't too hard because it is quite a straightforward plant, obviously producing it from seed or vegetative propagation, but cultivating crops is very different. And the art of cultivation is really organizing a plant to be produced in a bountiful and in controlled manner. So that is farming, and cultivation, I suppose, is the very first stage of farming. So before you become, a traditional modern farming enterprise, that's often associated to, sowing seed and growing a crop and then harvesting it. The cultivation of watercress is more of a 6-part journey through a season. Wow. Because we can get 5 or 6 crops a year. And that's the art of cultivation, where traditionally, if you're just letting it grow in the wild, you just get one crop. And that's very similar to a lot of arable crops. You just get a single crop of wheat or maybe a couple of crops of hay. But with watercress, it's cultivated, and therefore what we're doing is we're providing the conditions to allow it to grow in multiple times. And these growing locations have been specially designed going back into probably the 18th century when watercress beds were first created. And so the creation of watercress beds was specifically designed to allow easy cultivation, and that was to ensure that there was crop throughout the year. So where the traditional winter production was probably producing around about sort of 3 or 4 crops a year, our modern cultivation now, because we're growing it in the summer in slightly warmer conditions, and we've managed to work out how to produce seed and harvest the seed, we can get, 6 crops, possibly 7 this year, because we're actually trialing out some winter production. We're sort of going back 100 years and seeing how could we produce during the winter in the UK, because there's more demand than ever.
And what is it about Hampshire and Dorset in particular that make them so conducive to growing watercress?
Yeah, the cultivation, the farms that were created, say, over the last couple of 100 years, they were scattered all over the UK. And when they first started creating watercress beds, they just really tried to source water from anywhere. So the idea was that if you could get flowing water through beds, that was good. You then grow your crop. But what they found was that some of the growing locations weren't as good as the others. And that was generally down to two aspects: water flow. So was it throughout the year or the right times of the year? Now in winter, as we're going through this horrendous sort of weather pattern at the moment, we've got an awful lot of water, and therefore there are springs bursting everywhere. But once the actual rainfall stops and you get back into a more normal cycle, quite often some of those springs dry up. And so those farms that were first created a couple of 100 years ago were great in the winter, but they weren't quite as good during the summer months because those springs will die out. So that word, the Winterbournes, we've got a lot of locations around here called the Winterbournes, and that is effectively a reference to the Winterbourne springs or the rivers. So in around about the 1950s, they started to stop using some of the farms that were only good for winter. They started to focus on the farms that were good all year round in terms of their water supply. And we're talking about huge quantities. So on our 20 hectares in the UK, on a daily basis, we'll be handling 50 million litres of spring water. And that availability allows us to grow throughout the year. So we've concentrated down based on the availability of water, but also quality. Quality is the fundamental factor for our farms. We've got to make sure that the water is very, very clean and it's clear spring water. So the farms that we cultivate on now have got springs that may not have seen daylight for 60 years. So the last time that water was on the surface was 60 years ago, and it's been working its way down, cleaning itself, collecting lots of minerals in the bedrock, and then it bursts back out. And those are the farms that we focus on now. So we're looking at availability of water, the right locations for that, but also cleanliness of the water. Keep the watercress safe.
And this is chalk streams in Hampshire. I don't know if that applies to Dorset as well.
It does, yeah. Everyone will recognise the rivers that our watercress farms flow into. So down here in Dorset, we've got the Froome, and then we've got the River Piddle. So those are the two key ones. Up in, say, Wiltshire and up to, say, Shaftesbury, you've got the River Nadder that goes into the Avon, and then that will then go via Salisbury. So that's the Hampshire Avon. And then you've got the Test and the Itchen, which are world-class famous. You know, that's the ones that everybody knows about. And they're beautiful rivers, and we're kind of augmenting them. So we ensure that they get a plentiful supply of clean water daily. And that's part of our journey.
How has cultivation changed since Eliza James' day in the 19th and early 20th century?
Well, if Eliza came, I'd like to think that she'd be happy. She'd see watercress growing, because she obviously, you know, she was one of the pioneering founders of the industry. And we still have ladies producing watercress in the UK now. So Penny Eade has been growing watercress for the last 40-something years, and she's based up in Hampshire. I've known Penny for 30 years. Her father was a watercress farmer as well. And yeah, Penny is the person that really understands how to harvest watercress. She understands how to manipulate waters. So you have to look at a bed and actually understand what the bed's saying to you. Every bed has their own characteristics. So they talk about them as she quite often. You know, she's playing up. Or she's going to be great. You know, it's that kind of conversation. And Eliza would have been like that. So she would have been controlling the waters, deciding on where and how she was harvesting, the timing. But she must have been an amazing seller as well. So I think maybe it's a bit of like a power woman. She was like sort of going into the markets and convincing all of these market traders to buy off her. In terms of the cultivation, it still is the same thing. You know, we're working with beds of gravel, water that has to be flowing in control. You need to be in control of your water. And I think, you know, the fabric of the beds, we use concrete walls now. They would have used maybe wooden walls, but it's exactly the same crop. And it would have been harvested and had all the same challenges about transportation and shelf life and quality, pests and diseases. They haven't changed. So, you know, some of the pests that we've got now maybe disappeared for 50 or 60 years, and they came back again. We don't use any pesticides, so I'm sure we're going through the same kind of daily challenges as what Eliza did, which is nice.
Yes, it is. Yeah. On the subject of transportation, that must have helped Eliza a lot, the development of the rail network.
Yeah, but she would have made that happen.
Okay.
Yeah, the relationship between producing crops and transportation is symbiotic. She would have seen an opportunity, definitely. There was obviously a huge amount of investment in rail infrastructure. Food across the UK was produced locally in markets, and there were limitations to those markets. You could only get what you were told you're going to get. So if you had farmers producing X, that's what you could buy. But the freedom of having a national rail network that came in, a couple of 100 years ago, 202 years ago, that basically allowed people to have choice, and people are obsessed with choice now. And we talk about convenience. They were talking about convenience, the idea of having strawberries that were grown in Dorset and transported up to Leeds on the same day. That was a choice that people really wanted. So we were shipping up watercress from Dorset to Leeds, Liverpool, Sheffield, Manchester. So all of the Dorset watercress was going up there. And these farms down here were created in 1882, but they were created by people that were working in Hertfordshire, and they'd been doing it for maybe a decade, before, maybe 2 decades before. And Eliza was part of the network that were obviously producing crop to get it into London. And that was her network. And where we've taken advantage of transport in the last, sort of 50 years, she was doing that then. And so, her farms would have grown with the transport network, and they would have been a huge part of it. Literally carriages full of watercress, that would have been a mainstay, and it would have made it, work as a rail network. To call it the Watercress line says it all. It wasn't the Alsford line, the Watercress line.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Which still exists today, not transporting watercress, it should be said.
And so, so that relationship between us and the markets. So you have a farm, then you've got the markets, and then it's going to get sold on from there. There was always an intermediate. So there was somebody who brokered that kind of conversation. As now, you've got farmers focusing on farming. They don't need to be distracted. They need to have a really good seller and communicator, and someone that could deal with, the issues, sort of challenges with quality, or people saying that there were issues when there weren't issues, all of that kind of relationship. And therefore, I think Eliza would have had an amazing relationship with the markets, and she would have very carefully have to negotiate the markets and have a course, sort of customers. But there would have been a lot of competition out there. I'm sure she would have been like fighting for kind of the fake watercress, people hawking watercress from rivers and streams, trying to sell.
Fake watercress?
Well, you've got this kind of non-cultivated watercress. It could be wild watercress.
Okay.
And that would have been going to the markets, and people would have been selling that cheap. And the last thing, people wanted to do really unwittingly is to buy watercress that had been grown in a river that was, full of, nasties and bugs and bacteria. So there was this sort of growing trend to the idea that the watercress farmers would start to identify their watercress with really branded technology, so they started to come in with this idea about creating bunches. So the idea of the bunch, originally, it was just a long piece of watercress that went to market with the roots on it. Well, they started cutting that off, packing it, and preparing it in a format that could then be sold in bunches in these things called veneer boxes. They were basically a veneer, a piece of wood, very thin, woven to create this box. It looked like a strawberry box, but with a lid on it.
Yeah.
And those veneer boxes would be packed with watercress in bunch format. So the root's taken off, but they used to put a little stick in there, and they would use these phrases like stick to the crest with a stick, and it would say the brand, the farm. They would then, I suppose, educate the sellers and the market with medical representation. So they would take their water from their farms to their local doctor. We've got records and letters from Beer Regis to say, yes, your water is very, very clean. There are no pathogens in it. It's very safe to drink. Therefore, we can conclude your watercress is super safe. We do that now, and we would do that 150 years ago.
What is your impression of her, and why is her legacy important?
Well, she's very organised. She must have been very convincing and a great watercress farmer. I think, obviously, sort of a reputation in the industry that she's got, and all of those stories, they're all created for a reason. She must have been sort of one of a kind, really. for everyone to sort of romance over, her work and her achievements. And I think, obviously all her farms pretty much are still there. They're all still being operated. So I think she was well ahead of her time, but she obviously saw a place in the market, and she knew that there was a demand for health reasons. And she had enough tenacity to work out that if she could, develop the farms in the right location and find the right transport, she could achieve great things. And she certainly did. So yeah, she's revered. She's a bit of a legend. Not talked about enough, probably, in our industry.
Well, hopefully I will be changing that with this podcast. Sadly, James Fleet died in 1913, but Eliza continued running the Watercress business with her son Edwin until her own death in 1927. It wasn't all plain sailing for her. While she acknowledged that she had been extremely successful at selling watercress, she confessed to having plenty of bad luck in other things. A week after her Daily Mirror profile, she accused the paper of exaggerating her wealth, which had led to criticism from other Covent Garden traders for her boastfulness and people bothering her for money. A decade later, she was successfully sued by William Wilson for £115 for 420 watercress baskets she had ordered but not paid for because she'd got a better deal elsewhere. Despite her protestations to the contrary, when she died on the 26th of September 1927 from a combination of cardiovascular and kidney disease, she left a significant estate. Her son, Edwin, continued the business until he sold the watercress beds to Watercress Salads in 1959, a company which is still going strong today. Eliza's death was widely reported in the newspapers across Britain. Around 200 floral tributes were sent to her funeral from her customers, and a large wreath made from watercress sourced from her own beds in Hurstbourne Priors, Hampshire, was laid on her coffin. She may not be a household name today, but for those of us who know her story, she has left a lasting legacy.
That image feels perfect. The humble green that once kept her from the workhouse became the emblem of her power. And that's, to me, the reason why her story endures.
I'll conclude Eliza's story with her own words on women in business. Women have got just as good a chance as men in the market if they put the necessary work into the business. This is the part where I usually ask my guests for their contributions to the season's virtual potluck supper. However, I do feel a little guilty that 4 seasons in, I haven't made my own contribution yet. So today, I will be bringing a dish. But before I reveal what my choice of dish will be, I asked each of my guests how they like to eat watercress.
I can still remember one of my favourite meals from infant school, which was a salad with tiny cubes of beetroot and sprigs of watercress on the side. Probably on the plate because it's so high in iron and protein and vitamins, also fibre and antioxidants, and it wasn't known as poor man's bread for nothing. So I love a really simple watercress sandwich, a generous handful of watercress, good bread and good butter, and that's it.
Well, I had it this morning in a bacon sandwich.
Nice.
Yeah. And that is, sort of bacon and watercress is great. Cheese and watercress is great. We made pestos. That's really good because that's cheese and watercress again with obviously sunflower seeds or nuts. So yeah, we love the pestos because we've got so much of it. I can put it in anything, can't you? So you can make sort of like curries instead of spinach, you use watercress. So that works pretty well. But my son, he likes his watercress and jam sandwiches. And that was Mary Berry. That's how she had it.
Oh, that is interesting. What jam? I'm curious.
Strawberry jam or a raspberry jam, something like that. And it just sweetens it. I was saying earlier on about like the bitterness and the heat. Well, the jam just like kind of deals with that.
Yeah.
So that's good. Great in smoothies if you can, if you're in a smoothie kind of frame of mind.
Well, Sam, if I really have to eat it, I think I'd just have it in a salad. It's quite peppery, isn't it?
People either love it or they hate it because of its pepperiness. So you're in the hating camp, are you?
I'm not in the hating camp, but it needs to go with something. So maybe a roast chicken, and then it's doable. It has kind of that clean iron rich brightness, doesn't it? It's almost medicinal. I don't mind it. It wouldn't be my first choice. Like, I wouldn't make it like a main or centerpiece of my meal. Let's put it that way.
Ali is not the first person I've encountered who objects to the pungent nature of watercress. So to temper its pepperiness, I would suggest folding some chopped watercress into a creamy sauce, which is an ideal accompaniment to poached or roasted chicken, or for that matter, some simply cooked fish. Incidentally, chicken with watercress appeared on the royal wedding breakfast menus of both Prince Leopold, the youngest of Queen Victoria's sons, in 1882, and her grandson, the future George V, and Queen Mary in 1893. However, my absolute favourite way to serve watercress is in Locket's Savoury, a dish which Jane Grigson was fond of and originated in Locket's restaurant in London. Grigson's version features slices of ripe pear nestled on a bed of watercress atop a raft of lightly toasted bread. The toast is scattered with crumbled Stilton, then placed into a moderate oven until the cheese has melted. It's absolutely heavenly. So that's my contribution to the season's virtual potluck supper, and I'll be sharing those recipes with the paid subscribers to my Comfortably Hungry Substack. I hope that after listening to this episode, you agree that Eliza James was a remarkable woman. But her life could have turned out so differently. I came across the tale of another watercress seller from Kent recently called Sarah Cackett, who was born in 1838. Like Eliza, Sarah was from a poor background, but unlike the watercress queen, she was unable to shrug off the shackles of poverty. Sarah spent prolonged periods at the workhouse during her adult life. In her 30s, she was raped by a younger man. Although she was able to identify her attacker, her testimony was doubted on account of her having 2 illegitimate children, which marked her out as a woman of loose morals. She eventually became a wandering trader, hawking watercress from an old pram. On a blisteringly hot day in August 1911, 72-year-old Sarah set out with her pram filled with bunches of watercress. Nobody really knows what occurred, but her badly burned, naked body was discovered later that afternoon on the side of a road just outside Smarden, near Ashford in Kent. The watercress-filled pram was found a short distance away. One theory is that Sarah had sat down to rest her tired and aching limbs and to smoke her pipe. Some believe she failed to extinguish the pipe properly before returning it to her pocket, causing her clothing to catch fire. Her ghost is still said to haunt the place where she perished today. A huge thank you to Dr Alessandra Pino, Cheryl Cohen and Tom Amery for their insights today. You can find links to their social media accounts and websites in the show notes. Tom and I chatted for ages about watercress production, including the impact of climate change on this industry. So I'll be releasing an extended interview with him soon. If you want to read the full story of Sarah Cackett's tragic life, you can find it in Pluckley, The Making and Faking of a Ghost Story by Ed Adams, which I will also pop a link to in the show notes. If you happen to be in the Aylesford area later this spring, you may want to check out the town's annual Watercress Festival, which takes place on the 17th of May 2026. The Watercress Company are organising tours of their farm in the area, so it's a perfect opportunity to see this powerful veg growing in situ. You can even travel to the event on part of the original Watercress line. Although the event itself is free to attend, you will need to buy a ticket if travelling by train, and there are parking charges. In the next episode, I'll be looking at how the Persians were able to make and store ice in the desert. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you really loved it, please rate and review it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, as it really will help other listeners discover Comfortably Hungry. Don't forget to pop along to sambilton.com, where you'll find details on my books, which include my latest publication, Much Ado About Cooking, written in collaboration with Shakespeare's Globe. This new cookbook features recipes inspired by the food in the Bard plays and was huge fun to write, so I think it will be right up your street. You may also want to subscribe to the Comfortably Hungry Substack, which includes more detailed notes from the show. You can subscribe for free, but if you become a paid subscriber for £3.50 a month, you'll also get recipes inspired by the topics covered in the show and access to extra content. Alternatively, you can leave me a one-off tip via Ko-fi to show your appreciation. Just click on the relevant link in the show notes. Your support will help fund the research required to produce Comfortably Hungry. It also means that I can avoid including those pesky ads that may interfere with your enjoyment of the podcast. If you have any questions relating to this season's theme, you can leave a comment in the chat section of the Comfortably Hungry Substack page or tag me on social media. Remember, you can find me on Instagram, Threads and Blue Sky at Mrs. Bilton, that's with 2 S's. I'll be plunging back into the liquid world of food and drink history soon, but until then, take care. Comfortably Hungry is research produced and presented by food historian Sam Bilton, with sound mixing and production by Thomas Dinas of the Delicious Legacy podcast. Additional sound effects and music are provided by Zapsplat and Pom5.